The sound was not a crash, not an explosion. It was a low, groaning crack that traveled through the ice like a dying heartbeat, followed by a wet, sucking gasp. Then, silence. Boris Ignatieff did not need to look up from his notebook. He knew the sequence by now. He stood 200 meters from the jagged black scar that had just opened in the frozen skin of Lake Ladoga. The January wind, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, sliced through his worn coat. But he ignored it. His entire focus was on the second hand of his chronometer. He clicked it the moment the lead truck, a Gaz AA loaded with 90 sacks of rye flour, vanished from sight. He watched the violent churn of water in the hole, the frantic, futile bubbles of air escaping from the cab. The bubbles slowed, stopped. The water began to calm, already beginning to crust at the edges with a film of new ice. The physics of it were horrifyingly elegant. A vehicle with a mass of 2.4 tons, moving at 30 kilometers per hour, had encountered a zone of ice with a thickness of less than 20 centimeters. The stress had exceeded the material's yield point. Catastrophic, structural failure. The lake had consumed the truck, the flour, and 2 men, a driver and a loadmaster, whose names Boris did not know, in less than 45 seconds. He wrote the figure in his notebook. 45 sec to full submersion, air temp, 20 second quakes, water temp, approx 0 degrees C at surface, fracture propagation, radial, rapid. It was the third such entry this week. Each line was an epitaph written in cold, clinical data. His hand, ungloved to allow the precise notation, was blue-white, the pen shaking not from emotion, but from the sheer physical assault of the cold. He felt nothing as he watched the rescue team, mere specks in the distance, poke poles into the hole, knowing it was already a grave. His capacity for feeling, he believed, had been entombed weeks ago, buried under the mathematical certainty of loss. His superior, Captain Andreev, crunched through the snow towards him, his face a mask of frozen rage and despair. "Ignatieff, your report. What happened here?" Boris closed the notebook. His voice was flat, a dry rustle. "A predictable anomaly. The ice sheet is not uniform. Subsurface currents, residual heat from the lake bed, dissolved gases creating weak zones. We are driving blind across a material of inconsistent integrity. It is a statistical inevitability." "A statistical inevitability?" Andreev spat the words. "That inevitability was 2 tons of bread for the city. 2 men. Your job is to predict these zones." "My job," Boris said, finally looking at the captain, his eyes the gray of the ice under twilight, "is to measure. To measure, I need time, equipment, systematic survey teams. You give me a single battered truck and 2 conscripted fishermen. We are using a teaspoon to empty the ocean. The system is failing because it is not a system. It is a desperate, blind gamble." He pulled a small folded paper from his inner pocket. It was not his report. It was a different order, delivered to his freezing apartment at dawn. He had been carrying it against his chest all day, its presence a cold weight heavier than any instrument. "I am ordered to return to the city, effective immediately." Andreev stared, uncomprehending. "Return, now? The road is collapsing by the hour." Boris did not explain. He simply turned and walked towards the battered, emaciated truck that served as their mobile base. He did not look back at the new black scar on the ice, another wound in the fragile artery of Leningrad. The numbers in his head were already shifting, collapsing into a new, more personal equation. He had failed here, on the ice. The variables had been too many, the tools too few. Now another duty, one with a single, terrible variable, called him. The journey back to Leningrad was a passage through a silent, frozen hell. The truck crawled past lines of skeletal figures dragging sleds with tiny bundles, past the husks of other vehicles abandoned where they ran out of fuel or hope. The city itself did not emerge from the landscape. It solidified around them, a monstrous sculpture of ice and stone. The air smelled of burnt wood, frost, and underneath it all, the cloying, sweet odor of decay that no cold could fully mask. He went to his apartment building. The stairwell was dark, colder than the street. He did not go to his own door. He went to the one below, where his wife Irina had been staying with her sister after he volunteered for the ice road. He had thought it safer, warmer, a catastrophic miscalculation. He pushed the door open. The room was tomb cold. His sister-in-law, a shadow of a woman, sat on a stool, her eyes empty. She just nodded towards the bed. Irina lay under a thin mountain of every piece of fabric in the room. A blanket, a coat, curtains. Only her face was visible. It was not the face he remembered. It was a stark topological map of hunger. Skin stretched tight over fine bone, her lips thin and bloodless. Her eyes were closed. For a wild, irrational second, he thought of the data. Core body temperature drop, metabolic cessation, system failure. He pushed the numbers away, a dam breaking inside him. He knelt. He took her hand. It was not just cold. It was rigid, a thing of delicate wood. He had studied the phases of water his whole life, the transition from liquid to solid. He had never understood it until this moment, feeling the absolute, irrevocable solidity of her fingers in his. This was not sleep. This was a fundamental change of state. He did not weep. A sound escaped him, a low, animal noise of pure structural failure, the kind of sound the ice made just before it shattered. He pressed his forehead against the edge of the bed, the rough wool of the blanket scratching his skin. The equations finally left him. There were no numbers for this. His science, his logic, his world of measurable forces and predictable behaviors, it all crumbled into absolute zero. He had spent weeks trying to solve the problem of the ice, to find the pattern in the chaos. But death had no pattern. It was the ultimate random weak zone, and it had taken everything. Hours later, or maybe minutes, time had lost its metric. He stood by another frozen trench in the park. He watched as strangers wrapped her in a sheet. He saw the placard with her name hammered into the ground. It was a datum, a final terrible data point. As he turned to leave, a different soldier, crisp despite the pervasive filth of the city, approached him. Boris Ignatiev, hydrologist. Boris nodded, a mechanical action. New orders, from Front Command personally. You are to report to the Road Administration Office at Smolny. Not tomorrow. Now. Boris looked at him, then past him, at the endless, silent columns of smoke rising over the city. He thought of the black scar on the ice, swallowing men and flour. He thought of the rigid cold of Irina's hand. 2 different failures. 2 different kinds of ice. One he might have fought. The other had defeated him utterly. The officer misread his silence for reluctance. His voice dropped, not in sympathy, but in brutal clarity. The city has a week's supply left. Maybe less. The road is bleeding trucks and cargo. We are not just losing a battle, Ignatiev. We are losing the entire war of survival right there, on that lake. They tell me you understand ice, that you see what others do not. So see this. If that road dies, Leningrad dies, and your personal tragedy will become a single note in a symphony of millions. You can grieve later, or you can come and try to fix what is broken. Boris's eyes finally focused on the officer's face. The numbness inside him did not recede, but it changed. It hardened. It crystallized. The grief was still there, absolute and permanent, but now it had a direction. It was no longer a void. It was a lens, a cold, sharp lens through which to view the problem. He gave a single, sharp nod. He had failed to diagnose the weak zone in his own life. He had been too late. But on the ice, the weak zones were still forming. Trucks were still moving. The equation, while monstrous, was still active. He would not save Irina. But perhaps, with a colder eye and a harder heart, he could learn to read the ice well enough to save the next truck, the next load, the next city of Irinas, waiting for bread. He followed the officer into the gathering dusk, leaving the fresh grave behind. The engineer was gone, buried with his wife. What walked toward Smolny was something else, a weapon of pure, focused calculation, forged in personal ruin, and aimed now at the indifferent, murderous physics of the frozen lake. The Smolny office was a cathedral of controlled panic. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale tobacco, and a corrosive anxiety that no window could clear. Maps of Lake Ladoga covered every wall, but they were dead things, showing only flat blue and static shores. The real map, Boris understood immediately, was invisible. It existed in a dimension they were not measuring, the vertical, treacherous dimension of thickness. He was presented not to a theorist, but to a practitioner of disaster. Colonel Grechko, a man whose eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and whose left hand trembled slightly from perpetual adrenaline crash. Grechko did not offer a chair. He simply pointed a trembling finger at a map dotted with dozens of small, grim red X's. These are not coordinates, Ignatieff. These are graves. Each one, a truck, a semi-truck, a gun tractor. Swallowed. We are throwing our last resources into a hole. The drivers are calling it the gauntlet. They are driving with one door open, ready to jump. They are more afraid of the ice than of the German bombers. You have 1 week to change that. Boris stood before the map, his mind already dissecting the problem, overlaying his own memories of the groaning cracks, the sudden fractures. The emotional numbness that encased him like a shell served an unexpected purpose. It allowed him to see the problem with dispassionate, surgical clarity. His personal grief was a silent engine, powering a cold, relentless focus. "The map is wrong," Boris stated, his voice cutting through the low hum of frantic conversations. "You are mapping a 2-dimensional route on a 3-dimensional structure. Ice is not a road. It is a living, breathing, dynamic bridge. It flexes. It groans. It has tides of stress we cannot see. These marks," he gestured at the red X's, "they are not random. They are symptoms. We are treating a patient with a failing organ by blindly poking it with a stick." Grechko stared, the metaphor hanging in the smoky air. "A bridge? Fine. How do we reinforce it?" "We don't," Boris said, turning from the map to face the colonel. "Not yet. First, we diagnose it. We need to listen to its heartbeat. We need to take its temperature, inch by inch, hour by hour." He outlined his vision. It was not a single road, but a shifting network of potential roads, a matrix of safety. They would create a mobile surveying unit. Not a truck, but a fast, light sled. They would drill not just at suspected points, but on a grid. They would measure thickness, note the color and clarity of the ice, probe for the hollow, drum-like sound of a dangerous, rotten patch. They would log air temperature, wind direction, and, critically, the frequency and direction of traffic loads. They would build a living, breathing model of the ice sheet, a daily health report. The skepticism in the room was a physical force. A logistics officer snorted. "You want to turn a supply route into a laboratory? We need tons moved, not data points." Boris's reply was icily calm. "You are losing tons. You are losing them because you value movement over knowledge. You are sending blind men sprinting across a floor you know is mined. My method is slower for one truck, the survey sled, but it will make every truck that follows exponentially safer. It is the difference between a hemorrhage and a controlled transfusion." He needed an ally. He found him not in the command staff, but in the waiting area outside, a hulking, bear-like man in a naval pea coat, his face scarred by frostbite and etched with a profound, weary grief. This was Captain Mikhail Misha Korchagin, former commander of a Ladoga supply barge sunk by Stukas in the autumn, drowning half his crew. He was waiting for a combat assignment that never came, his skills deemed useless on the solid ice. Boris approached him, not with camaraderie, but with a shared language of loss and failure. "They say you know the lake, not just its surface, its moods, its treachery." Korchagin looked up, his eyes like chips of flint. "I knew its water. Now it is all stone. What do you want?" "To learn its new language," Boris said. "The language of solid water. I need someone who isn't afraid of its whispers. I am building a team to listen to the ice, to hear it, before it screams." Something shifted in Korchagin's gaze. The impotent rage found a target. Not the Germans, not the commanders, but the lake itself, the entity that had taken his ship and was now taking the trucks. He nodded once, a decision made in silence. They were given a derelict sled, a team of 3 terrified young conscripts who knew nothing of ice, and a mandate that felt more like a prelude to a court-martial. Their first survey run was not a mission of hope, but a tense, silent reconnaissance into enemy territory, where the enemy was the very ground beneath them. Boris worked with a methodical, almost robotic intensity. He showed the boys how to drill, not with force, but with a sensitive, listening pressure. He taught them to read the core sample, the clear, strong ice, the milky, bubbly, weak ice, the terrifying, porous, candle ice that collapsed like sugar. Korchagin, with a sailor's instinct for vibration, would lie flat on the ice, his ear against its surface, listening for the subaudible groans of settling pressure, the faint, sinister trickle of water moving in a crack below. They worked under a vast, oppressive sky, the distant city a smudge of smoke to their south. German observation planes, Framies, circled high above, but they were not worth a bomb run. They were just specks on a white sheet. Then, near a desolate island, Korchagin rose from his listening position, his face pale. "Here. It hums. Wrong." Boris drilled. The auger bit through the first 20 centimeters of solid ice, then dropped into emptiness, with a sudden, sickening lurch. He pulled up the core. The lower half was not there. It was a hollow shell. A massive hidden cavity yawned beneath a deceptively solid roof, a death trap large enough to swallow a tank column. Boris marked the coordinates on his new blank map with a black circle. A zone of absolute exclusion. He felt no triumph, only a grim validation. This was the enemy. Not a vague statistical inevitability, but a specific, locatable, tangible threat. They found 2 more that day. One, a spreading network of hairline fractures, another a region of ice thickened by pressure ridges, but as brittle as glass. That night, in a drafty bunker on the lake's shore, Boris transformed their raw data. He did not create a simple line. He created a topographic map of safety. He used shades of pencil, dark, confident lines for the strong spine of good ice, dotted lines for cautious, light traffic routes, and stark, hatched zones of black for the death traps. It was the first true anatomical chart of the road of life. He presented it to Grechko at dawn. The colonel studied it for a long, silent minute, tracing the routes with a calloused finger. He saw not just a path, but the reasoning. He saw the intelligence gathered, the threats identified and circumscribed. "This," Grechko said finally, his voice rough, "is not a road order. This is a battle plan." He looked at Boris, seeing not the broken husband from a week ago, but a strange new kind of combat officer. "You are not just an engineer. You are a scout in a white hell. Your weapon is knowledge." He issued the order. The next convoy, 60 trucks, loaded with ammunition and medical supplies, would not follow the old, straight, deadly line. It would follow the winding, seemingly illogical path of Boris's map. It would snake around the black zones, stick to the dark pencil lines. Boris and Korchagin positioned themselves at a vantage point. They watched as the first truck, its driver clutching the new diagram, approached the first diversion. A wide berth around the island where the hollow cavity lay. The driver hesitated, the old instinct to drive straight fighting the new, untested intelligence. Then he turned the wheel, the truck crawling cautiously onto the route Boris had certified. One by one the column followed, a slow, heavy serpent coiling across the white expanse. No cracks echoed, no groans answered. The convoy reached the far shore, intact. For the first time in weeks, a full supply run had been completed without a single loss to the ice. Boris received the radio confirmation in the bunker. The men around him let out a ragged cheer. Korchagin clapped a massive hand on his shoulder, a gesture that nearly buckled his knees. Boris felt nothing resembling joy. He looked at his map, at the black zones still lurking. He looked at the chronometer on his wrist, the same one that had timed a drowning weeks ago. He had not saved anyone today. He had merely postponed a death. The ice was not defeated. It was learning. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that matched the lake's own, that the lake's next move would be more violent. It would not just hide its weaknesses, it would create new ones, catastrophically, under the boots and wheels of those who thought they had tamed it. The diagnosis was complete. Now the real crisis was coming. Success was a fragile crust over a deep, dark ocean of reality. The map worked. For 3 weeks the convoys snaked along Boris's penciled arteries, and the gauntlet of invisible traps was avoided. The drivers, superstitious men in a world ruled by chance, began to call the winding path the snake's track, and spoke of the quiet hydrologist with the dead eyes in hushed, reverential tones. They thought he had tamed the ice. Boris knew better. He had not tamed it. He had merely learned to read its passive malevolence. His victory was one of avoidance, not control. And avoidance, he calculated coldly, had a diminishing rate of return. The lake's surface was finite. As they charted more weak zones, the viable corridors for hundreds of heavy trucks narrowed into frightening, congested choke points. His map was becoming a diagram of a tightening noose. He tried to explain this to Colonel Grechko, to plead for resources, to not just chart the ice, but to reinforce it, to experiment with flooding thin areas to thicken them. to create deliberate pressure relief cuts. He was met with the brutal arithmetic of the siege. Every man, every piece of wood, every liter of fuel was accounted for in the ledger of immediate survival. There was no reserve for engineering. There was only the next convoy, the next ton of flour. Boris's warnings were filed as theoretical concerns. His personal state was a mirror of the road, functional on the surface, hollow beneath. He slept in the shore bunker, ate the coarse bread, and worked 18-hour days. He no longer dreamt of Irina's face. He dreamt of fracture patterns, of spreading dendritic cracks that looked like dead nerve endings. His grief had undergone a phase change, just like water, to ice. It was now a structural component of his being, hard, transparent, and bearing immense, silent weight. It was Korchagin, the sailor, who first noticed the change in the enemy's tactics. The high-flying Framies were replaced by lower, slower Henschel spotter planes. They didn't just observe. They circled specific stretches of the active route with predatory patience. Korchagin, squinting into the frozen sky, growled his assessment. They're not watching the road. They're studying the traffic, the rhythm. They're learning the melody of our supply line. Boris understood instantly. The Germans were no longer content to let the lake do their work. They were identifying the bottlenecks, the points where Boris's safe corridors forced the trucks into predictable, concentrated streams. They were turning his map into a targeting guide. 3 days later, the melody was shattered. It began not with the scream of Stukas, but with the deeper, heavier drone of Junkers bombers. They came in low from the west, riding the gray ceiling of cloud. The air raid sirens on the shore were a futile, mournful wail against the vastness of the lake. There was no cover, no deception, just a line of heavy trucks, loaded with canned meat and shell casings, crawling across a flat, white plain. The world dissolved into noise and physics. The first bombs were not aimed at the trucks, but at the ice ahead and behind the lead convoy. Massive geysers of black water and shattered ice erupted, cutting off retreat and advance. Then the bombers worked on the column itself. Direct hits were almost incidental. The shock waves were the real weapon. The concussive force traveled through the ice sheet like a hammer blow on a colossal drum. Boris, observing from a distant observation post with Korchagin, felt the tremor through his boots. He saw it happen through his binoculars, his mind dispassionately recording the catastrophe as data. A truck near the center of the line was not hit, but the ice beneath it, stressed by the nearby detonation, let out a visible, shearing crack. The vehicle tilted, slowly, almost gracefully, and slid into the freezing water, with barely a splash. Then another, and another. Not from bombs, but from the ice itself, failing under the induced trauma. When the planes departed, leaving the sky ringing with silence, the scene was one of grotesque ruin. A kilometer-long stretch of the vital corridor was now a jigsaw puzzle of broken ice plates and yawning black Polinyas. 6 trucks were gone. 3 more were crippled, stranded on isolated ice floes like shipwrecked beasts. The precious cargo was at the bottom of the lake, or scattered across the ice. And the road, the carefully nurtured, mapped, life-giving artery, was severed. Boris and Korchagin took the survey sled out to the carnage. The cold air was now thick with the smell of cordite and diesel fuel. Men fished for survivors with poles, their faces blank with horror. Boris ignored the human drama. He walked to the edge of the largest Polinya. It was a wound 30 meters across, its edges a jagged mess of upthrown ice shards. The open water, black as oil, sloshed hungrily. Korchadin stood beside him, his voice a raw whisper. "It's over. They'll find a new route. It will take days, a week. The city doesn't have a week." Boris did not hear the despair. He heard the problem. He stared into the black water, then at the fractured edges. His mind, the cold engine powered by loss, began to spin. He was not thinking of rescue or relocation. He was thinking of repair. The standard doctrine was abandonment. Go around. The ice would eventually refreeze in days, perhaps a week. But time was a commodity more scarce than fuel. He knelt, studying the edge. The ice was thick, a good 40 centimeters. The bomb had not just blown a hole. It had cleared a space. The problem was not the thickness of the surrounding ice, but the gap, the void. An old memory surfaced, not of grief, but of profession. A lecture on metallurgy, on repairing cracked engine blocks in Siberian mines. The concept of a cold patch. You didn't wait for the metal to grow back. You bridged the gap with a new material, bonded under pressure and freezing cold. He looked from the water to the sky, then to the broken supply crates floating in the slush. "We don't go around," he said, his voice flat, analytical. "We bridge it." Korchagin stared at him as if he had gone mad. "Bridge? With what? There is no steel, no timber." "With the lake itself," Boris said, rising. He pointed at the upthrown blocks. "We use those as a foundation. We contain the water, and we force it to freeze on our schedule. We perform surgery on the wound. We give the lake a scaffold and command it to heal." He began sketching in his notebook, his fingers clumsy with cold, but his lines precise. He drew a crude rectangular cofferdam made of wooden planks and ropes, meant to be floated into the Polinya and anchored to the solid ice edges. Inside this contained area, they would pump the freezing lake water, layer by thin layer, allowing each to flash freeze in the sub-zero air, building up a new, artificial ice bridge from the bottom up. It was insane. It was a race against the very thermodynamics of heat loss, against the constant movement of the water, against the possibility of another air raid. He presented the plan to a haggard, smoke-stained Colonel Grechko in the command bunker an hour later. The colonel looked at the drawings, then at Boris's impassive face. "You want to build an ice foundry in the middle of a bomb site, under enemy observation. It is the only variable we can control," Boris replied. "The alternative is a 5-day detour through uncharted ice. Probability of loss on a new route within the first 24 hours exceeds 60%. This repair, if it works, can be executed in 36 hours. The risk is concentrated and finite." Grechko rubbed his face. He was not weighing hope against doubt. He was weighing one terrible gamble against another. He looked at the map, at the severed lifeline. He looked at Boris, this ghost of a man who saw the world in probabilities and material stresses. "Get the materials," Grechko said, the words sounding like a death sentence. "Take whatever you need. Korchagin, you're with him. If this fails, it won't matter what I do to you. The city will do it for me." Boris received the order with a nod. No fear, no anticipation. Only the next sequence in the calculation. As he walked out into the biting wind to gather planks, pumps, and desperate men, the numbness within him found its perfect counterpart. He was not going to fight the ice or the Germans. He was going to enlist physics itself to turn the lake's own murderous cold into a tool of salvation. The diagnosis was over. The desperate, reckless surgery was about to begin. The theory was a clean line on paper. The reality was a screaming chaos of cold, exhaustion, and near impossible physics. Boris's ice foundry was not built in a controlled environment. It was assembled in the mouth of a freezing hurricane on the edge of a black abyss that had just swallowed men and machines. He requisitioned not engineers, but a motley crew of naval carpenters from the sunken flotilla, 2 traumatized pump operators from the city's waterworks, and a dozen infantrymen whose job was not to fight, but to haul and hold. They looked at the Polinia, then at Boris's skeletal, intense figure, with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Korchagin, his presence a mountain of grim purpose, translated Boris's calm, technical directives into roared orders that brooked no hesitation. The first task was to salvage the floating wreckage of the supply convoy itself. Using grappling hooks and sheer brute force, they dragged splintered wooden crates and broken pallets from the icy slurry. These would be the raw material for the cofferdam, the wooden mold that would shape the new ice. The carpenters, their fingers bleeding on frozen wood and rusty nails, worked on the solid ice edge, lashing together a giant, rickety rectangle of planks. It looked like a child's idea of a raft, absurdly fragile against the scale of the wound in the lake. Meanwhile, Boris and the pump team wrestled with the machinery. The pumps were meant for draining basements, not for industrial ice formation. Their hoses were stiff, threatening to crack. The gasoline engines coughed and sputtered in the cold. Every piece of equipment was a betrayal waiting to happen. As they worked, the German observation plane returned. It circled lazily, a vulture assessing strange prey. The men froze, looking up, expecting the scream of bombers. None came. The spotter plane banked and flew away. This was worse. It meant they were being watched, their desperate experiment noted. The next visit would not be for observation. Boris used the fear. "They think we are salvaging," he stated, his voice carrying over the wind. "They think this is a cleanup operation. We have until they realize we are building, not retrieving. Work faster." The crude wooden frame was finally maneuvered to the Polinia's edge. The moment of truth. Using long poles, they pushed it out onto the black water. It floated, lopsided and pathetic. Now came the delicate, terrifying part. Anchoring it to the solid ice walls of the hole. Men had to lie on their stomachs at the very edge, drilling holes into the vertical face of the ice to secure ropes. One slip, one sudden shift, and they would join the drivers below. Boris did not order them. He went first. He lay on the cold lip, his body stretched over oblivion, and drilled the pilot holes himself. The ice vibrated under him, groaning with the memory of the explosion. He felt no courage, only a hyper-focused calculation of angles and pressure points. His personal void made the physical void beneath him less frightening. With the frame loosely secured, they began the pumping. The theory was simple. Pump lake water into the contained rectangle. The sub-zero air would flash freeze a thin layer on the surface. Pump another layer on top. Repeat, building a new ice sheet from the top down, like forging a metal plate, one molten droplet at a time. The water gushed from the hoses, hitting the wooden frame and the existing water within. It did not freeze instantly. It swirled, mixing with the warmer water from the lake's depth, slowing the process. A film of ice began to form, but it was milky, weak, and riddled with bubbles. The rotten ice he feared most. It would never hold a truck. Boris watched, his mind racing through variables he had not accounted for. Convection, the latent heat of the water body, the insulation provided by the water itself. His plan was failing in real time, succumbing to the lake's complex, chaotic reality. Korchagin saw it too. He muttered, a sailor's curse against an unforgiving element. It's making slush. Not a bridge, a grave covered in sugar. Then, a new sound cut through the wind. The distant, growing thunder of aero engines. Not a spotter. A pack of them. The men looked up, panic erasing their fatigue. They were sitting ducks on a white plain, clustered around a perfect target marker. The black rectangle of the Polinya. Boris did not look up. He stared at the failing ice, at the swirling water. The incoming bombs were just another variable, a time constraint. His gaze fell on the broken, upthrown blocks of ice littering the perimeter, jagged and dense. The solid good ice. A new idea, born of absolute desperation, exploded in his mind. It was not elegant. It was brutal, wasteful, and shockingly direct. It violated every principle of conservation of resources. It was exactly what the situation demanded. "Forget the pumps!" he shouted, his voice cracking with an intensity none had heard before. "The new ice is too weak. We need a core, a foundation. We use the old ice." He pointed at the massive, table-sized blocks heaved up by the blast. "We push those into the hole. We sink them. We fill the void with solid material, then we freeze around it. We are not growing a bridge. We are dumping rubble and gluing it together." It was a monstrous shift in logic. They were not patiently cultivating ice. They were conducting emergency landfill. As the first bombs began to fall, striking the ice field a few hundred meters away, showering them with frozen debris, the crew launched into a frenzied new operation. Using the sleds, ropes, and inhuman effort, they manhandled the giant blocks of ice to the edge. They levered them over, crashing them into the black water. The blocks bobbed, then slowly, reluctantly, began to sink, stacking up in a chaotic, submerged pile. They were filling the vertical void with solid mass. The bombers made another pass, closer. A machine gun stitched a line of holes across the ice towards them. 2 soldiers fell, not from bullets, but from slipping in their frantic scramble. Boris felt a hot sting on his cheek, a piece of flying ice sharp as shrapnel. He wiped the blood, irrelevant. They kept pushing ice. The Polinya began to look like a bizarre frozen quarry. The wooden frame, now irrelevant, was shattered by a falling block. It didn't matter. The concept of a mold was abandoned. This was raw, brutal infill. When the bombers left, low on fuel and likely convinced they had disrupted a salvage operation, the crew stood heaving for breath, surrounded by the reek of gasoline and cordite. In the center of the wound was a jagged, uneven mess of submerged and semi-submerged ice blocks, a glacier's vomit. Only now did Boris return to the pumps. "Now," he ordered. "Pump the water! Over the rubble! Fill every cavity! Freeze it in place!" The water sprayed over the chaotic pile. This time it worked. The water had less volume to heat, flowing into the gaps between the cold, solid blocks. It froze faster, clearer, acting as a cementing agent. They worked through the night under the ghostly light of flares, the men moving like automatons. Boris moved among them, no longer just the planner, but a foreman of the abyss, his face a mask of frozen blood and concentration. He was not their leader. He was the manifest will of the idea itself, relentless, and unforgiving. By dawn, the Polinia was gone. In its place was a grotesque, hummocky patch of new ice, a ugly scar of white and gray, blending uneasily with the surrounding smooth sheet. It looked unnatural, a blight on the landscape. Boris ordered the heaviest thing they had, the empty survey sled, to be driven across it. The driver, his eyes wide with terror, gunned the engine and shot across the patch. The ice held. It groaned and crackled ominously, but it held. A test was not proof. Boris needed data. He needed the ultimate stress test. He looked at Korchagin, then at the remaining stranded truck on an ice floe 50 meters away. "We need a loaded truck," Boris said, his voice hollow from exhaustion. "The cargo on that stranded vehicle. We transfer it. Then we drive that truck across the patch. Empty weight is not a valid simulation." It took another 2 hours of back-breaking, dangerous work to transfer the crates of artillery shells from the stranded truck to the shore. Finally, the truck itself, now empty, but still weighing several tons, was inched onto the new ice. The engine revved. The tires bit into the rough surface. The entire patch settled with a deep, bowel-shaking crunch that sent men stumbling back. Cracks webbed out from the tire tracks, but they stopped, arrested by the interlocking mass of the rubble core inside. The truck reached the other side. Silence. Then a ragged, disbelieving cheer erupted from the exhausted crew. They had done it. They had closed the wound. Boris did not cheer. He walked out onto the patch, knelt, and took a core sample. The ice was a Frankenstein's monster, a chaotic jumble of clear old ice and bubbly new cement. It was hideous. It was unstable. It would require constant monitoring. But it was a road. He looked up at the gray sky, then back at the ugly, vital scar. He had not outsmarted the lake. He had wrestled with it in the mud and the blood and the freezing water, and he had forced a stalemate. He had discovered a terrible, wasteful, but functional new principle. When the lake created a void, you could fill it with its own broken bones and use the cold as mortar. He returned to the shore, past the celebrating men. Korchagin fell into step beside him, saying nothing. Boris's mind was already racing ahead. The Germans would understand what had happened. They would bomb again. They would bomb better. The road would suffer more wounds. This patchwork method was too slow, too labor-intensive for multiple simultaneous fractures. As they approached the command bunker, Boris was no longer thinking about the miracle of the repair. He was designing a system, a standardized response, a kit of parts and procedures. He had won a battle, but the war of attrition on the ice had just entered a new, more terrible phase, and he was now the architect of its desperate, ugly defense. The ugly scar on the ice held. For 2 days, convoys rumbled across the patched Polinia, their drivers crossing themselves not for spiritual protection, but in superstitious awe of the jagged, groaning patchwork beneath their wheels. At headquarters, the feat was hailed as a miracle of improvisation. Boris Ignatiev was called a hero of labor. Boris heard the words and felt nothing. He saw the maps with the new, hastily drawn symbol over the repaired zone. A black circle, now filled with a crude crosshatch, like a stitched wound. It wasn't a symbol of victory. It was a monument to catastrophic vulnerability. The bombing had revealed the road's true nature. Not a line, but a string of critical nodes, the bottlenecks, the narrow corridors his own maps had identified. The Germans had simply read his work and chosen the most efficient points of attack. He stood before Colonel Grechko in the bunker, not for praise, but to deliver a cold, tactical assessment. Spread before them were not just maps of ice thickness, but new overlays Boris had created. Diagrams of blast radius, shockwave propagation through ice, and load-bearing calculations for various repair methods. The repair took 38 hours, Boris stated, his finger tapping the chart. We used 22 men, diverted 3 critical pumps, and consumed 80 liters of fuel. We were lucky. The next attack will not be on a single point. It will be a pattern. Simultaneous strikes here, here, and here. His finger stabbed at 3 key bottlenecks on the map. A coordinated attack would shatter the road into isolated segments. Our current response model is linear. 1 crisis, 1 team. It is too slow. It will collapse under parallel demand. Grechko studied the overlays, the festive mood evaporating. You're saying our miracle is a one-time trick? It is a prototype, Boris corrected. A proof of a terrible concept. Now it must become a system, a doctrine. We must assume the road will be wounded, repeatedly, and we must have the surgical tools ready to suture it before it bleeds out. He presented his vision. The ice road would no longer have just transport crews. It would have dedicated mobile repair battalions. Ice medics. They would be stationed at strategic intervals along the route, not in warm bunkers, but in forward camouflaged depots on the ice itself. Each depot would be pre-stocked with the brutal, simple toolkit their desperate experiment had proven. Pre-cut timber for quick frames, gasoline-driven pumps with hardened hoses, stacks of grappling hooks and ropes. Most importantly, each medic team would include a surveyor trained in Boris's methods, able to assess not just the hole, but the stability of the ice around it. Furthermore, he proposed a radical, counterintuitive defensive measure. We must create decoy vulnerabilities, he said. Here and here. He pointed to areas away from the main corridors, where the ice was actually relatively strong. We mark them with visible, shoddy repairs from previous fake incidents. We let the spotter planes see them. We bait the bombers to waste their loads on reinforced ice, while camouflaging the true weak points. It was a plan of profound cynicism, turning the road into a labyrinth of lies and traps. Grechko authorized it without a word. The stakes had transcended morality. Boris's personal transformation was now complete. The man who had once sought to understand the lake's pristine logic now dedicated himself to orchestrating its systematic deception and brutal repair. He moved into a tent on the ice itself, near the central depot. His world shrank to the roar of generators, the shriek of saws cutting timber, and the constant, gnawing fear of the next drone in the sky. He trained the first teams himself. He showed them how to drill not just for thickness, but for sound after a blast, to listen for the hidden, spreading fractures that were more dangerous than the hole itself. He taught them the rubble and freeze protocol, standardizing the chaotic struggle of the first repair into a series of cold, executable steps. He also instituted a new rule. Every repaired zone was to be marked not with a flag, but with a small painted number on a stake, linked to a logbook, recording its composition, repair date, and maximum safe load. The road was becoming a documented patient, its medical history written in ice and diesel. The test of the new doctrine came not a week later. It came in 48 hours. The German Air Command had indeed learned. They did not send a single wave of bombers. They sent 3 in staggered intervals, targeting the three primary bottlenecks Boris had predicted. The attacks were synchronized with the precision of a Swiss watch. The first bombs fell at dusk. Klaxons wailed across the ice, not from shore, but from the newly established forward depots. Boris, in the central tent, watched on a crude plot map as runners brought reports. Not just reports of damage, but of response. Sector 7, Polinia 20-meter diameter. Medic Team Alpha is mobilizing. Pumps en route in 3 minutes. Sector 4, multiple fractures. Partial submersion of a loaded truck. Team Bravo is engaging, extracting crew first. Sector 9, direct hit on a depot. Team Charlie is relocating to auxiliary stockpile. It was no longer chaos. It was a distributed, ugly, but functioning immune system, responding to multiple wounds. Boris did not move to any site. He was the central nervous system, monitoring the flow of information, rerouting supply sleds from untouched depots to those damaged, calculating which repair was most critical to re-establish a flow. He went to Sector 7, the largest wound. The scene was not the panicked struggle of the first time. It was a grim, noisy ballet. One squad was already hauling prefabricated timber frames onto the ice. Another was setting up pumps, their hoses snaking across the ice like black veins. A surveyor was on his belly, drilling test holes around the edge, calling out thickness numbers to a scribe. Korchagin was there, his voice a constant roaring drumbeat coordinating the movement. There was no heroism, only a brutal, weary competence. Boris observed, making minute adjustments. The current is stronger on the north edge, he noted to the team lead. Double the anchor lines there. Pump in shorter bursts to allow faster flash freezing. He was tuning the machine. As they worked, the second wave of bombers came. The team didn't scatter. They had drilled for this. The men not essential to the pumping and framing seized rifles and Lewis guns mounted on sleds, laying down a pathetic but symbolic curtain of fire into the sky. It was not about hitting planes. It was about asserting a presence, about refusing to cower. A bomb landed 300 meters away, showering them with ice. The frame shifted. A pump operator fell, his hose whipping wildly. Another man stepped into the freezing spray without hesitation, grabbing the hose, wrestling it back under control. The process hiccuped, but it did not stop. Through the long, terror-filled night, across 60 kilometers of frozen lake, 3 separate battles were fought not against men but against geometry, thermodynamics, and time. At dawn, as the third, exhausted German wave departed, the reports filtered back to Boris's tent. Sector 7, patch stable. Light traffic can resume in 2 hours. Sector 4, fractures stabilized. 1 lane open. Sector 9, depot lost. Supply chain rerouted. Repair delayed, but ongoing. The road had been cut in 3 places, and in all 3 places it was healing. Slowly, ugly, but surely. The convoys, held in protected bays, began to creep forward again, navigating around the active repair sites like blood cells flowing past scabs. Boris stood at the edge of the Sector 7 repair zone as the first cautious truck, loaded with medical supplies, rolled across the new ice. The driver's face was etched with a new kind of fear, not of the unknown, but of the known, of the groaning, man-made monstrosity beneath him. He made it across. Korchagin came to stand beside Boris, his face gray with exhaustion. It worked. Your system. It held. Boris looked not at the truck, but at the men. They were slumped against their equipment, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air, their eyes blank with a fatigue deeper than sleep. They were not triumphant. They were used up. He had not just created a system. He had created a factory for consuming human endurance. It held this time, Boris said, his voice barely audible. They will increase the bomb size. They will use delayed action fuses to target the repair crews. They will adapt. He turned from the scene, walking back towards his tent. The cold within him was now absolute. He had engineered a response, but in doing so, he had quantified the horror. He knew exactly how many man-hours, how many liters of fuel, how many cubic meters of timber were required to offset a 1-ton bomb. He had turned survival into a grisly equation, and he was responsible for solving it over and over again until the lake thawed or the city died. The doctrine was proven. Now came the endless, grinding war of attrition, fought in the screaming wind, on a canvas of ice, where every victory was just the prelude to the next, more terrible wound. The system became a grinding, relentless religion. The ice medics were no longer men. They were components in Boris's machine, their lives measured in effective work hours before collapse. The depots were attacked, rebuilt, moved. The decoy sites were bombed, then re-established further down the line in a macabre game of chess played with live explosives. Boris's maps grew terrifyingly complex, a living document of scars, stress zones, predicted targets, and repair timelines. He could now estimate, with chilling accuracy, how long a polynya of a given size would take to close based on air temperature, wind chill, and available crew. He existed in a state of perpetual frozen calculation. He slept in snatches, jerked awake by the memory of a potential flaw in a load-bearing calculation or the distant, familiar drone of engines. He ate mechanically, fuel for the processor of his mind. His body was a gaunt tool, his eyes permanently squinted against the wind, seeing the world only as vectors of force and points of failure. Then, a new variable entered his equation. It was not a bomb, nor a crack in the ice. A convoy, limping back from the eastern shore after delivering ammunition, brought a cargo that was not on any manifest: children. 32 of them, evacuated from a bombed-out orphanage in Leningrad. They were packed into the back of an open truck, wrapped in every rag available, their faces small, pale moons against the dark canvas. The truck had suffered a thrown track on the ice and was being towed by another. It stopped near Boris's central depot for a hasty repair. Boris was supervising the recalibration of a pump motor when he saw them. He didn't choose to look. His gaze simply swept over the scene as a data point, a stopped vehicle, a potential obstruction. But the data point resolved into human forms, small, silent, watching him with the huge, hollow eyes of chronic hunger. Eyes he had seen before, in Irina's face in her final days. His mind, a fortress of numbers and protocols, suffered a catastrophic system error. The equation broke. The image of these children here on this mechanical hell of ice and diesel would not translate into a variable of mass, cargo, or logistical delay. It was an irrational number, a prime number of suffering that could not be factored. One little boy, no more than 6, unwrapped a skeletal hand from his blanket and pointed a finger at Boris, then at the groaning, ugly patch of repaired ice nearby. The boy's voice was a thin whisper, carried on the wind. "Is that the bridge that breaks?" The words were a surgical strike. Boris stood frozen, the wrench in his hand feeling suddenly alien, monstrous. This child's life, like thousands of others in the city, was a function of the road. His survival depended on the integrity of the ugly scar the boy was pointing at. a scar Boris had designed, a calculation he had performed. He gave no answer. He turned away, his heart hammering a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He walked not to his tent, but away from the depot, out onto the open ice, towards a testing area far from the route. The wind screamed in his ears, trying to scour him clean. He needed the void, the white noise. But out there, alone with the howling emptiness, the dam holding back his personal ocean of grief, finally shattered. It was not a weepy collapse. It was a violent, silent upheaval. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in total systemic failure. The images crashed over him, not in sentimental flashbacks, but in brutal, sensory fragments. The feel of Irina's wedding band as he pulled it from her rigid finger. The sound of the shovel biting into the frozen earth of the common grave. The sight of the child's accusing finger. He had treated the road as a grand, terrible engineering problem. An epic struggle against nature and the enemy. He had framed his grief as fuel for this fight. But in those children's eyes he saw the horrifying truth. He was not a hero battling a monster. He was a foreman in a factory of suffering, desperately trying to keep the conveyor belt moving. A belt that carried these children past the jaws of death. His brilliant system, his patches, his doctrines, they were just slightly more efficient ways to manage an unending catastrophe. They didn't end the horror. They just regulated its flow. A profound existential nausea gripped him. What was the point of mastering the ice if all it did was ferry more souls into this grinding meat grinder of a siege? Was he truly saving lives? Or was he just making the logistics of mass dying more efficient? He did not know how long he knelt there. The cold began to bite through his shock, a physical imperative. When he stood, his legs were leaden, but something had shifted. The cold focus was still there, but its nature had changed. It was no longer fueled by detached numbness. It was now fueled by a specific, razor-edged, and terrible love. The love he had failed to give to Irina in her final days. The protection he had been unable to offer, transmuted into a ferocious, boundless imperative, directed at these faceless thousands. He would not save them from the war. He could not give them warmth or plenty. But he could, by God, give them a bridge that did not break. Not because it was an interesting engineering challenge, but because on the other side of that bridge was a fragment of a chance. A spoonful of gruel. One more day. For the boy with the pointing finger. For all of them. He returned to the depot a different man. The same icy determination, but the source had been purged of abstraction. He saw his crew not as components, but as men whose exhaustion was the price of that chance. He saw the groaning ice not as a fascinating material failure, but as the sworn enemy of that boy's future. When Korchagin approached him later, bearing a report of a new hairline fracture detected by a surveyor, Boris took the paper. His eyes scanned the numbers, the calculations already flowing. But now, overlaying the math, was a new, visceral image. A truck loaded with children, its wheels slipping into that hairline crack, the ice shearing open. "Reroute the night convoy 500 meters south," Boris said, his voice quiet but carrying a new iron timbre. "Assign medic team Echo to that fracture, not just a patch. I want it reinforced with a double-layer cross-brace of timber beneath the ice surface. A preemptive strike. We are not just repairing failures anymore, Mikhail. We are building a fortress, one those children can sleep through." Korchagin studied him. seeing the change in his friend's eyes. The dead gray had been replaced by a glacial, almost frightening blue intensity. The resources, that's a major diversion for a crack that might hold. It will not hold, Boris said, his gaze locked on the horizon where the truck with the children had disappeared. The stress from the next heavy haul will propagate the fracture. The margin of error is no longer a statistical percentage. It is one child. One child is the margin. And the margin is 0. He turned and walked into the command tent. He began to redraw the protocols. Not for efficiency, but for absolute, over-engineered, wasteful safety. He ordered thicker ice for all primary routes, mandated longer curing times for patches even if it caused delays, designed redundant support structures for every known weak zone. It was no longer about keeping the road open, it was about making it indestructible. An impossible goal, but the only one that now made sense. The war on the ice entered a new phase, not of desperate reaction, but of furious, preemptive care. Boris Ignatieff, the engineer who had once sought to understand the lake, had become its most relentless, loving adversary. He was no longer fighting for Leningrad's survival. He was building, with ice and timber and sheer will, a road worthy of its children. Every groan of the ice was now a personal threat. Every successful crossing, a sacrament. Winter's iron grip began to show its first fatal tremors. The sun, a weak brassy coin, hung slightly longer in the sky. The brutal static cold of deep February softened into a more treacherous, mobile chill that seeped into the ice from above and below. Boris's instruments told the story his bones already knew. The lake was waking up. His new doctrine of zero margin had created a kind of brutal stability. The road, grotesquely patched and reinforced like a soldier crisscrossed with bandages and splints, held. The bombings continued, but the ice medics had become so proficient, their depots so well stocked and dispersed, that repairs now happened with a grim, clockwork predictability. The convoys rolled, a metronomic heartbeat of survival for the city. But Boris's mind, now attuned to the lake's every whisper, heard a new, more profound threat. It wasn't the bombs. It was the slow, inexorable tilt of the planet towards the sun. The enemy was no longer just the Luftwaffe. It was thermodynamics. Spring. He initiated Operation Palliative. While the surface traffic continued, he launched secret survey missions to the extreme northern and southern edges of the ice sheet, areas previously ignored. The data was worse than he feared. The ice near the shores was candling, decomposing into vertical, needle-like crystals that lost all horizontal strength. It looked solid, but would collapse like a rotten floor. The window for the road of life was closing, not with a slam, but with a silent, pervasive rot. It was during this tense twilight period of the road's life that the enemy delivered an unexpected variable. A lone Junkers bomber, perhaps damaged or off course, released its payload early in a panicked, strafing run. The bombs fell not on the main corridor, nor on a decoy site, but on a secondary, ice-covered bay near the western shore, an area considered militarily irrelevant. The subsequent reconnaissance photos, rushed to Boris's tent by a breathless scout, showed something that made his meticulously ordered mind stutter. The bombs had not just made a hole. They had shattered a vast, ancient pressure ridge, a chaotic mountain range of ice blocks heaved up years ago and sintered into a dense, chaotic mass. The explosion had pulverized this ridge, scattering house-sized chunks of ice into a wide, shallow bay. The resulting field was not open water. It was a kilometers-wide slurry of broken ice, a jagged, chaotic mixture of solid fragments and freezing slush. Korchagin saw only another bombing report. "A waste of their bombs!" Nothing there. Boris stared at the aerial photograph, his mind stripping away the context of the attack, seeing only the raw material. He saw not destruction, but aggregate. He saw not a problem, but a perverse, brutal solution. The ultimate rubble. "They've given us the answer," Boris said, his voice low with a kind of reverent horror. "To what?" "To the thaw," Boris replied, tapping the photo. "The shore ice is candling. It's turning to mush. It cannot hold weight, no matter how we reinforce it. We need a new kind of road. Not on the ice. Through it." He unfolded a clean sheet of drafting paper. His hand moved with a speed born of absolute certainty. He did not draw a line. He drew a process. "We cannot rely on a continuous sheet anymore. It is becoming unreliable. So we abandon continuity. We build a discontinuous road, a road made of islands," he explained. "They would use the bay shattered by the Germans as a quarry. They would use winches, explosives, and brute force to break up the already fractured ice into manageable, boulder-sized blocks. These blocks would not be pushed into holes. They would be towed, like glacial rafts, into position." His plan was to create a floating causeway across the weakest, candling zones near the shores. They would sink these massive ice blocks in a deliberate, staggered line, creating a submerged chain of stepping stones. On top of these sunken anchors, they would build up a roadbed using the rubble and freeze method, but on a colossal scale. They would be creating artificial ice shoals, using the lake's own frozen bones as a foundation where none existed. It was insane. It was the logic of the mad or the desperate. It was moving mountains of ice to cross a puddle of slush. Colonel Grechko, when presented with the plan, looked from the apocalyptic photo to Boris's fever-bright eyes. "You want to mine the ice and build a bridge with it. In less than 3 weeks, before the whole sheet goes. The road will die in 10 days as the shores rot," Boris stated. "This," he pointed to the shattered bay, "is a gift. Pre-broken material. We salvage their destruction to build our escape. We don't just repair the road anymore, Colonel. We evacuate it. We build a life raft made of ice for the ice road itself." There was no alternative. The order was given. What followed was the most physically brutal operation of the entire winter. It was not engineering. It was glacial alchemy. Boris's ice medics became ice miners. They dangled on ropes over fissures, planting small, shaped charges to break the monoliths into towable pieces. They drove modified trucks with massive ship winches stolen from the port, cables as thick as a man's wrist, screaming under the strain of moving ice boulders that weighed tons. Boris was everywhere. He was no longer just the mind. He was the muscle of the idea. He operated a winch himself when a crew faltered, his thin frame vibrating with the machine's torque. He waded into the freezing slurry to direct the placement of a key block, the cold water soaking him to the chest, his commands issuing through chattering teeth. The image of the children of Irina was gone now, burned away in the furnace of immediate, physical exigency. There was only the next block, the next cable, the next explosive charge. Korchagin led the towing operations, navigating the lead sled through the maze of flows with a boatman's instinct. The process was agonizingly slow. They would position a block, sink it with drilled holes and added weight, then pump water over and around it, creating a new, composite ice mound. Then they moved to the next. The causeway grew, inch by tortuous inch, a grotesque, stumbling serpent of ice crawling out from the shore. The men worked in shifts, but the cold and wet were merciless. Frostbite cases skyrocketed. Exhaustion was a tangible presence, a fog thicker than the lake mist. Boris drove them, and he drove himself hardest of all, a spectral figure coated in a permanent shell of frozen spray, his eyes measuring, always measuring the alignment, the settlement, the integrity of their monstrous creation. After 7 days and nights, the causeway reached the solid ice of the main sheet, a jerry-built, hummocky, but solid bridge over 200 meters of rotten shore ice. The first test was a single, empty truck. It crossed, lurching and swaying over the uneven surface, but it crossed. Then a loaded one. The causeway groaned, settled a few terrifying centimeters, and held. It was the most ugly, precarious, and magnificent thing Boris had ever built. It wasn't a road. It was a monument to refusal. A middle finger raised against the thaw, constructed from the rubble of the enemy's hatred. As the first full convoy began its cautious journey across the ice causeway, Boris stood at its origin, watching the trucks vanish into the gray distance. He felt no pride, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had taken the enemy's violence, absorbed it, and transmuted it into a path. He had used the lake's own dying body to prolong its usefulness. He looked at his hands, cracked and bleeding, permanently stained with grease and frost. He had become something neither human nor machine. He was a force of nature himself, a principle of will opposing entropy. The road lived, but it was a monstrous Frankenstein's creation, and he was its fevered doctor. The final enemy, the true thaw, was still advancing, and he knew, with the last of his energy, that his final act would not be more construction. It would be a calculation of the exact, final moment to order the retreat, to abandon the magnificent, terrible thing he had built to its inevitable dissolution. The fight was no longer to save the road, but to salvage every last second of its life. March arrived not with a warmth, but with a betrayal. The sun gained a deceptive strength, its light a pale gold that reflected blindingly off the ice, creating a world of eye-searing whiteness and deep, deceptive shadow. The cold at night was still lethal, but during the day, a thin, insidious film of meltwater appeared on the surface of the ice, turning the road into a treacherous mirror. Trucks now left dark, wet tracks that wept behind them. Boris's world had shrunk to a single terrible calculation: the rate of degradation. His instruments measured it obsessively. The ice was no longer gaining mass from the cold air below. It was losing it to the sun above and the warming water below. His maps, once marked with zones of strength and weakness, were now overlaid with a new, grim metric: estimated days of bearing capacity. The numbers bled away like sand in an hourglass. The monstrous ice causeway, his masterpiece of salvage, was now the most critical point of failure. Its composite nature, a jumble of blocks cemented by newer ice, made it uniquely vulnerable to differential melting. A solid sheet might rot evenly. His causeway would dissolve from within, its cement turning to slush, while the giant blocks shifted and rolled. He established a 24-hour watch on it. Surveyors probed it every 4 hours, measuring not just thickness, but the cohesion of the ice between the blocks. The data was a slowly steepening curve of decay. Boris plotted it on graph paper, extrapolating the line to its fatal conclusion. He was no longer building or even repairing. He was conducting a death watch. The command wanted a final massive push. One last convoy of fuel and food that could tip the balance for the city until the true spring and the opening of shipping lanes. It was to be the largest convoy of the season. 50 heavy trucks, each loaded to its absolute limit. Boris stood in the command bunker, facing not just Grechko, but officers from the front and the city Soviet. He laid his graph before them. The line of decay intersected with the required load capacity in 3 days. The causeway will not support a concentrated convoy of that mass. Not in 3 days. The probability of catastrophic structural failure exceeds 80%. A political officer, a man whose face had never known the wind of the lake, scoffed. Your probabilities have been wrong before, Comrade Ignatiev. Your entire endeavor has been defying probabilities. The city needs this convoy. Your pessimism borders on defeatism. Boris did not argue. He looked at the man with the hollow eyes of someone who has conversed with the absolute. The ice is not ideological. It does not respond to exhortation. It obeys physics. I am not being pessimistic. I am being accurate. Send the convoy as planned, and you will lose it all. The men, the trucks, the cargo. You will gift it to the bottom of the lake. Silence hung in the smoky room. Grechko studied Boris's face, then the graph. What is your alternative? We do not send a convoy, Boris said quietly. We send a procession. He unveiled his final plan. It was an exercise in minimalism, the opposite of his previous grand gestures. The 50 trucks would not travel together. They would be spaced out over 36 hours, with a minimum of 500 meters between each vehicle. The weight on the causeway at any one time would be a fraction. Furthermore, each truck would be stripped of every non-essential item, extra fuel cans, tools, even a second crewman. They would travel at a walking pace, 5 kilometers per hour, to minimize vibration. And they would not use the main central path of the causeway. They would follow a staggered zigzag route he had charted, distributing the stress across its entire width. It was a plan that acknowledged fragility. It was an admission that the road was dying. It is inefficient. It is slow, the political officer protested. It is the only way the cargo gets across, Boris replied, his final word. The order was given. The great dispersion began. For Boris, the following day and a half were the most psychologically agonizing of the entire winter. He had moved past physical exhaustion into a state of heightened, painful clarity. He positioned himself at the landward edge of the causeway. He would not monitor from a tent. He would see it, feel it, hear it. As the first truck, a massive ZIS-5 laden with steel barrels of aviation fuel, approached the causeway, the world seemed to hold its breath. The driver, briefed personally by Boris, downshifted to a crawl. The tires crunched onto the uneven, glittering surface of the ice bridge. Boris closed his eyes. He did not need to see. He needed to listen. He heard the groan of the ice, a deep basso profundo complaint. He heard the squeal of the suspension, the soft, sickening crackle of surface melt giving way. He heard the driver's engine throttle up slightly, a spike of panic, then steady again. The sounds painted a picture in his mind clearer than sight. Stress, distribution, resonance. He opened his eyes as the truck reached the midpoint. The causeway visibly flexed, a slow, sinking motion of centimeters. Water seeped up around its edges, pooling in the tire ruts. The driver kept moving, a statue of concentration behind the wheel. the truck climbed the far slope onto the relative solidity of the main ice sheet and continued into the white distance. First point plotted. Success. The next truck came an hour later, then another. Each crossing was a unique, tense symphony of strain. Boris, rooted to his spot, became a human seismograph, interpreting every groan and crack. He ordered minor adjustments. Truck 7 would take a path 3 meters to the left. Truck 12 would reduce its speed by 1 kilometer per hour. Night fell, then dawn came. The procession continued, a slow-motion ballet of survival. Boris had not slept, had not eaten. His entire being was an instrument tuned to the failing ice. Then, at the 34th truck, a loaded flatbed with crated artillery pieces, the music changed. The driver, perhaps numb with fatigue, strayed slightly from the prescribed zigzag. The left side tires veered onto a section Boris had marked as suspect. The sound was different. Not a groan, but a sharp, percussive snap, like a giant bone breaking. A jagged black line raced across the causeway's surface ahead of the truck. The vehicle lurched, its rear end sinking visibly. Boris was already moving, not running, but striding with a terrible purpose onto the causeway itself. He waved frantic signals to the driver. Do not stop. Do not brake. Keep moving forward. Stopping would pool the weight. Forward momentum might skate it over the breaking point. The driver, eyes wide with terror, stamped on the accelerator. The truck's wheels spun, churning slush, then caught. It surged forward, lurching like a wounded animal as the crack widened behind it, gushing black water. It cleared the weakened section, lurching onto safer ice. But the damage was done. A new, lethal weak point now bisected the causeway. The ice bridge was cut. Boris assessed the fracture. It was too wide, the edges too unstable, for a standard repair. There was no time. 13 trucks remained on the far shore, their cargo desperately needed. He made his final calculation. It was not engineering. It was a gamble with geometry. The fracture was clean. The edges, though crumbling, were thick. The distance was just under 4 meters. He radioed the remaining trucks. His order was simple, insane, and absolute. You will not cross the bridge. You will jump it. Unhook your trailers. You will carry only the tractor unit and the primary cargo on your flatbed. You will back up 200 meters. You will achieve a speed of no less than 30 kilometers per hour. And you will fly. One by one, the remaining trucks transformed from cargo haulers into makeshift projectiles. They backed up, engines roaring in the vast silence. Then they charged towards the fracture. Boris stood to the side, a conductor without an orchestra, as the first truck hit the gap. For a heart-stopping second, it was airborne, a grotesque, leaping metal beast, its shadow flying over the black water. It landed with a colossal, jarring impact on the far side, skidding, swaying, but remaining upright. It had made it. The next followed, and the next. Each a brutal, jarring impact that further shattered the edges of the ice. The causeway was committing suicide to give them passage. The final truck, the 50th, made its run. As it launched, the entire landward section of the causeway, weakened by the repeated impacts, gave a final, shuddering sigh and began to collapse. The truck landed, its rear wheels crashing through the dissolving edge. It seemed to hang, then clawed its way forward, dragging itself onto solidity as the ice bridge it had just left disintegrated into a tumble of churning blocks and foam behind it. Silence. The road was gone. The causeway was a dissolving wreck. The last truck grew small in the distance. Boris stood alone on the shore, looking at the wreckage. There was no fanfare, no relief. The great machine he had built, nursed, and defended was now just so much debris, melting into the rising water. He had extracted from it every last ounce of life, squeezed it until it broke, and in the breaking, it had delivered its final gift. He turned his back on the lake. He walked past the empty depots, the abandoned sleds, the silent pumps. Korchagin fell into step beside him, saying nothing. They walked towards the waiting car that would take them back to the city, a city that would live, for now, because a bridge had broken at the exact, calculated moment, and not before. Boris did not look back. His work was a series of numbers in a logbook, a memory of sounds in the ice, and 13 sets of skid marks on broken snow where trucks had taken flight. He had not saved the road. He had simply finished its equation, solving for x, where x was the last possible second, the final ton, the ultimate margin. And in that final brutal calculation, there had been, against all the fury of war and nature, 0 fatalities. The margin had held. It was over.